Good morning, Professor.
Good morning.
Now, let me just say a couple of things first, if I may, before Ms. Richards starts questioning you again, because we're meeting under new conditions, as we all know, given the restrictions which were introduced as from today. Those who are watching remotely won't see, they never do see, the audience which is here, nor do you. You just see the same faces. But for those who are watching out there and for your information, the only people who are present in the hearing room are the legal team supporting Ms. Richards, your own counsel, some technicians, and a couple of members of inquiry staff. There's no public here, but they are watching online. So this is the conditions under which we are currently meeting. I'll continue to wear a mask because that's what we ask people to do in these premises, though it does interfere with talking sometimes, which is why I take it down when I'm talking to you. Ms. Richards.
Professor Hay, I want to pick up the picture in relation to VCJD and the response to the risk of VCJD and the various notification exercises. We'd looked yesterday at your letter in November 1997 and the meeting that you described following that. Your statement tells us that at some point after that, at Manchester, you were able to switch products to those manufactured from US plasma fairly quickly. Is that right?
That's correct.
But you, there is also evidence to suggest that may not have been the position universally for all centres. Shimit, could we have on screen, please, HCDO 40-133_188, please. This is a letter you wrote, January 1998. It's addressed to Dr. Ludlam, and it's implementation of our recommendation on CJD. That is presumably a reference to the UK HCDO committee's recommendation, which you discussed yesterday afternoon.
It is.
And then you talk about the commercial grapevine tells me that some centres, particularly Oxford, Birmingham Children's and Adults and the Royal Free Hospital, are all still using large amounts of BPL products and continuing to order them. I suspect that these three centres all use significant amounts of 8Y, which may present them with a financial problem. I was able to implement our policy rapidly because there were essentially no attached revenue consequences. I hear that Frank Hill may be wanting to move straight to recombinant, but I worry that the other two centres were basically not fully sold on the policy. If they don't implement this policy, it significantly undermines our position. Do you know whether the anxieties expressed in that letter, the concerns expressed in that letter, continued, or did other centres implement the UK HCDO recommendation?
I think that at some point BPL withdrew their products, and then there was a gap, substantial gap, until they started to manufacture the same products using imported American plasma. I can't remember exactly how long that took. The financial problem that I am alluding to is because those centres that continued to use a lot of 8Y, 8Y was quite cheap, but it was also very popular. It had a good viral safety record. It was also reasonably all right for von Willebrand's disease. So some centres were genuinely quite attached to the product. It wasn't just because it was inexpensive. But the fact that it was inexpensive meant that for them to change to American products would have incurred a considerable cost. For me, that wasn't a problem because I had already switched all my patients to high purity products, so I was using more expensive products in any case. I can't honestly remember how long this situation went on.
Okay. We move then, I think, to just before we get to the national notification exercise in 2004, you had an exchange of correspondence with BPL in 2003. Seamus, if we could have HCDO 40-254_117, please. This is a letter that you wrote in May of 2003 to BPL, and it says that you were recently notified by the Transfusion Transmitted Working Party that your centre, Manchester, had received batches manufactured from plasma pools contaminated with plasma from patients who subsequently developed VCJD. And you're expressing here displeasure at not having been informed of this directly by the manufacturer and having learnt of it through this route of the Transfusion Transmitted Disease Working Party rather than directly from BPL. What had actually happened that gave rise to this correspondence?
Well, it just struck me that there were various other routes of communication that could have been used that would have informed me much more quickly. It was perfectly reasonable that they should inform the TTI Working Party, and they were coordinating the whole thing. But had I been informed earlier, I would have acted earlier to identify the recipients of these products. And they had supplied these products to the Manchester Centre through the transfusion service, and either the transfusion service or the manufacturer would have known that it had been supplied to me and should and could have informed me earlier.
The next, I think, key event in relation to VCJD and haemophilia centres and haemophilia patients was the 2004 national notification exercise. Now, as I understand it, this was triggered by a case of VCJD reported in the recipient of a blood donation in December 2003, and then a second possible case in July 2004. Is that correct?
That's correct. I mean, this was obviously a game changer because up until this point, the possibility of transmission through blood transfusion was a theoretical possibility, and there was a lack of concrete proof that it could occur.
And then if we go, please, Seamus, to WITN 3289110. So we're going to look at some of the documents, Professor, from the 2004 notification exercise. So this is a letter of the 7th of September 2004 from the CJD Incidents Panel, which your statement tells us had been set up in 2000. And we can see from it, it's setting out recommendations of the panel for tracing and assessment of patients exposed to plasma products, using donations from individuals who subsequently developed VCJD. We're told in the second paragraph it was based upon a blood risk assessment carried out by an external consulting firm or organisation, which had then been considered by the various committees who we see described there, including the Committee on the Safety of Medicines. And then it reads, batch-specific manufacturing data from the fractionators concerned has been used with the risk assessment to estimate the potential VCJD infectivity in each batch of implicated product. For each of the major assumptions underlying the risk assessment, the most precautionary option was chosen. And then we can see the panel's identified what it means by being at risk for public health purposes. And then there are 3 levels identified: high, medium, and over the page, low. We're told in the 3rd paragraph, the uncertainties underlying the assessment of risk are great. Several precautionary assumptions are involved. The at-risk threshold for public health purposes is not a precise guide for advising individuals about their potential additional risk of developing VCJD. And then we can see in the bold print there's a recommendation of action to be taken in relation to those who fall within the high category. The batches should be traced and the individual recipients considered at risk of VCJD for public health purposes. The extent of individual exposure to these batches should be documented. Medium, effort should be made to trace these batches and assess the potential additional risk to individual recipients to determine if special precautions should be taken for public health purposes. The extent of individual exposure to these batches should be documented. And then low, these batches do not need to be traced and the individual recipients do not need to be informed. Now, we'll look at some of the other documents in a moment, but can you perhaps provide us with an overview of what the response to this then was by UK HCDO and individual haemophilia centre directors?
We were informed one way or the other, mostly by the database and through the transfusion transmitted disease working party of the batches that had been implicated, and these changed with time as further patients presented with variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. And we did our best to trace the ultimate destination for all those products, who had received them. Obviously, all the patients were written to, including those who had not received British blood products. The initial notification was to all patients with bleeding disorders, not just those who'd had British products, because it was felt that they would hear about this in the press and they might worry that they would be affected in any case. So we felt we had to write to everyone. We had to speak to our surgical colleagues and the hospital administration because the measures included, amongst those patients at high risk, certain types of surgery had to be done with disposable instruments. Endoscopes had to be quarantined if they were used in high-risk individuals. So the notes had to be noted in that way. And if the patient required surgery, this became a consideration that had to be dealt with. We had to report back to the database the risk level of each of our patients. There are forms in your exhibits that show the returns to the database, which show the amount of each batch that the patients had received, if they had received any. And if they had not received any implicated batch, that's also recorded. And the outcome of the discussion with the patient is also recorded, because this was a very unusual situation. And in the advisory committee, we had lengthy discussions about how we should approach this, because this was a condition for which there was no test and there was no treatment. So we couldn't test the patients to discover whether they had been exposed or not. And even if we knew for sure that they had been exposed, there was no treatment, and we were unsure of the likely natural history because as things unfolded, recipients of implicated blood transfusions developed variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease as long as 8.5 years after exposure. And they were all homozygous. So there was the theoretical possibility that had been raised that heterozygotes might also develop variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, but perhaps after a very prolonged period. Now, here we are 30 years down the line, and that hasn't happened, but it was in those early days raised as a possibility. So far, only homozygotes have developed a problem and no recipients of pooled blood products.
So this was a national exercise organised centrally by the CJD Incidents Panel with the notification, the information we see here, the assessment, the strong recommendation to recipients of this letter, which included UK HCDO, to take the steps there set out.
And the National Haemophilia Database collating the data and, amongst other things, reporting it on to the HPA, which continues on a 6-monthly basis to this day.
And if we just look at some of the documents that were also provided by the CJD Incidents Panel at the time of its publication of its recommendations on the 7th of September, we've got, please, Shomik, at WITN 3289113. We're not going to need to look at the detail of every document, but just to see the broad nature of the accompanying documents. So again, dated the 7th of September, this was a table of the VCJ implicated batch numbers. So that information identifying the source in terms of manufacture, the PFC or the BPL was identified. And then if we go over to the third page, we can see, we don't need to go through the details of it, the specific batches. That information had all been gathered and collated nationally, had it?
Yes.
And then if we go, please, Shomik, to WITN 3289114. Again, we don't need to go to the detail of it, but this is a clinical information sheet produced by, amongst others, the Health Protection Agency. We can see the date from the bottom of the page, 7th of September 2004. So this was, as it were, information for clinicians to accompany the recommendations.
Yes.
And then if we go, please, to WITN 3289115. We can see here there was also, same date, 7th of September 2004, at the bottom of the page, again, a centrally prepared patient information sheet. And we'll just look briefly at the various headings. So one, what is variant CJD? And then if we go over the page, what's this about? So it sets out what has led to the exercise. The first case reported the death of a person from VCJD who'd received a blood transfusion from a donor, so the first case of transfusion-associated VCJD, and then a second probable case. We can see the bottom half of that page talks about why am I being contacted, so it explains to patients the purpose of communicating with them. If we go to the next page, we can see a description of what measures are already being taken. And then point 5, and in relation to blood, because it's uncertain whether VCJD can be transmitted by blood, the UK Blood Services have taken a number of precautionary measures, and those are then set out from 1997 onwards. We can see the bottom of the page, the CJD incidence panel they're referred to, its establishment in 2000. And then if we go over the page, we can then see under in point 7, an explanation to patients of what's changed in terms of policy. The next page, who is affected, so it identifies the groups of those who may be affected by this, and then how does this affect me, and it talks about the practical implications for patients. And then if we go over the page, we can see it continues by giving patients information about the extent to which they face a risk. That's point 11. Does this mean I'm going to suffer from VCJD? Can I be tested? What happens if I develop strange symptoms? Will this mean I won't be able to get life insurance? And we can see from the top of the next page that that's an issue that's already been addressed. Insurers will not refuse insurance because someone is categorised at risk for public health purposes. And then it continues. So this was obviously a national leaflet prepared for the benefit of patients. Did haemophilia centres send this information sheet to the patients whom they were notifying, as far as you're aware?
As far as I'm aware, yes.
And then if we go just to WITN 3289118, please, Shumik. This is described as the patient notification exercise inquirer handling protocol. If we go to the second page, bottom of the page under the heading timing, we can see a timed plan of action. 9th of September information will be sent to haemophilia doctors, immunologists, medical directors of trusts. Then the plan for haemophilia doctors and consultant immunologists looking after patients with primary immunodeficiency to send out patient letters on the 20th of September, and then a full press briefing by the Department of Health planned for the 21st of September. Certainly the letters we've seen Professor Hayes sent to patients, many of them are dated the 20th of September 2004. Again, as far as you're aware, was the expectation of UK HCDO and the VCJD incidence panel that all haemophilia centres would send those communications to their patients at the same time?
Absolutely. I mean, the timing of this was determined, as far as I remember, by lodging of a parliamentary question, which was going to alert the press the following week. So the whole thing had to be rushed along. And it was strongly emphasised to centres that this matter had to be dealt with as a matter of urgency.
And we can see that from the UK HCDO letter to directors at WITN 3289111. So this is the 9th of September. At this point in time, you were vice chair, Professor Hill was chair, and this letter was sent by him. But we can see it's to all haemophilia centre doctors. It's for urgent and immediate attention. And then we can see in the first main paragraph reference to the toolkit, which I think are the documents that we've just been looking at.
Yes.
And then the actions are to brief centre staff to ensure we can get letters out to all patients so that they're given comprehensive information at the same time. The letter to patients needs some insertions, telephone numbers, etc. Should go to all patients or parents of children with haemophilia and other bleeding disorders. If possible, use the letter as sent. Some may wish to adapt because of local reasons. Ensure you file copies in each patient's notes. And then it's felt that all patients need to be informed, even those not affected, so that they are informed about the events and understand the implications. Does it follow from that UK HCDO, in relation to this exercise, had decided to go further than the, as it were, minimum requirements of the Vcjd incidence panel, because your proposal was to communicate with every patient whether or not they'd ever received British products within the relevant time frame?
That's an interesting question. I think I can't remember whether the incidence panel wanted us to write to everybody or whether it was a UK CDO decision, to be perfectly honest. But I think whether it was or not, we certainly felt that we needed to inform all patients, because the patients would not necessarily know whether they'd had British blood products or not. And they might think that they were involved. And so when we spoke to the patients, we gave all of them a certain amount of core information, whether they were affected or not, and then put it into a personal context. So if we, for example, knew that they had not been exposed to UK products during that period, we could tell them that and say, well, now you know all about all that we know about variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, but it shouldn't affect you. And with the others who had British blood products at that point, we were still in the process of working out which batches were affected and assessing the level of risk. So, you know, you wouldn't be able to attribute a level of risk at that point, but you would be able to tell them whether they'd had British blood products and might be involved. So I don't really know the answer to your question, but that was our thinking.
And we can see the exposure assessment form that you referred to at WITN 3289116. So again, we can see this is part of the 7th of September 2004 production of documents, the dates at the very bottom of the page. So this is a form to be completed for all patients with bleeding disorders, and then a copy should be sent to the National Haemophilia Database. There's the start question: did the patient receive any UK-sourced pooled factor concentrates or antithrombin between 1980 and 2017? Yes or no gives the answer to whether the person's at risk of VCJD for public health purposes. There's then an exposure assessment. So that's an analysis undertaken by reference to each individual patient. And then over the page, we can see the last box asks the question: has the patient asked to know if they received the implicated batch? When was the patient informed if they'd received the implicated batch? The purpose of that last box was presumably to ensure that patients received the information that they wanted to, but were allowed to choose not to receive information if they didn't want to.
That's right. I started to explain that earlier, but didn't really finish. Because it was such an unusual situation, in that there was no test that we could offer them, and there was no treatment. We realised that some patients might prefer not to be told. So they were all provided with the background information about variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, transmission by blood transfusion, the very least theoretical risk of transmission through pooled blood products, what we thought the risk was, the business about it having only affected homozygotes who made up about a third of the population, and so on. But in relation to their own exposure, they were offered the choice of being told or not. but it was important to document that choice both in the notes and centrally, so that you could continue to respect that choice, or at the very least, if there were overwhelming reasons to tell them, put the choice to them again.
And your statement tells us that not all patients could be traced. Do you know what steps were taken, first of all, at Manchester, in your capacity as director of the centre, to trace patients, or was that not a problem that affected Manchester?
I don't remember it being a particular problem at Manchester. There are always some patients, particularly those with mild bleeding disorders, who are lost to follow up and need a lot of chasing. I can't remember whether it was a particular problem in relation to this. There were also problems, of course, tracing who had received the implicated batch, as I detail in my Section 9 response.
Then if we move from 2004 to 2006, could we, Shumik, have ABMU 5053, please? So if we just go a little closer. So this is an email from you at 14th of November 2006. Vcjd and plasma products, look back and patient notification. And so this is being sent by you now as chair of UK HCDO to centre directors. You refer in the body of the email to 2 further batches of concentrate, which include donations from patients who subsequently developed VCJD, relating to products released in 1988 through the transfusion service in Tooting, Wales, Colindale and Birmingham, not previously notified because it was not possible at that time to trace their distribution. If you received these products, you may have to notify your patients. And then if we go over the page, we don't need to go through the detail of it, but we can see this is a letter explaining that there have been these 2 further batches identified that weren't included in previous notifications. And is this right? Essentially, what centre directors were being asked to do in 2006 was to check their records to see if they had received these batches, and if they had, to then go through the same exercise in relation to those batches as had been done in 2004.
Yes, and we were also trying to stir up some centres that had not responded, in our view, adequately to the first request.
We then, I think, next see VCJD in 2007. Shumik, could we have HCDO 40131_006, please? So again, this is an email from you. This is January 2007. And then we see, if we go over the page, a draft press release. So this tells us that there's been a 4th and therefore presumably a 3rd case, because we previously looked at cases 1 and 2 having triggered the 2004 notification. A 4th case of VCJD associated with blood transfusion. So this is a draft press release from the Health Protection Agency. And then if we go, please, Shumik, to HCDO 40131_007. And if we zoom in on the top half of the page, this is an email from you in your capacity as chair of UK HCDO, 16th of January 2007. You were I understand in this email notifying all UK HCDO members about this fourth case. The second paragraph explains that the case contracted VCJD from the same donor as the third case, and then refers to the patient being still alive and manifesting clinical signs of suspected VCJD 8.5 years after receiving the blood. This is the longest incubation period reported so far in relation to this mode of transmission. Remains the case that VCJD has not been reported in recipients of non-cellular pooled blood products. This does not therefore change the advice that we would offer our patients, and we were not planning a mailing to patients. Do I understand this to be you communicating news of the fourth case to directors, but because there were no new implicated batches, there was no further notification exercise to patients? Is that right?
Yes, it strengthened the evidence that variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease could be transmitted by a whole blood transfusion, but it didn't actually change anything that we would have advised the patients or any of our actions. And so it was felt that a further notification exercise would be superfluous.
And then there was then a further national notification exercise in 2009. Shimit, could we have WITN 3289130, please? So we can see this is a letter from the Health Protection Agency's CJD section, February 2009, to all UK Haemophilia Centre doctors, informing them of a post-mortem finding of asymptomatic VCJD, abnormal prion protein in a person with haemophilia. And then the second paragraph explains that this patient had been treated in the 90s with several batches of UK-sourced clotting factors, including one batch of factor VIII that was manufactured using plasma from a donor who went on to develop VCJD. And then it explains that the haemophilia patient was in his 70s when he died of a condition unrelated to VCJD, 11 years and 1 month after receiving the batch of implicated factor VIII. And then the significance of this, we probably pick up from the last 2 lines of this page. This is the first time that VCJD abnormal prion protein has been found in a patient with haemophilia or any patient treated with plasma products. And then if we go over the page, we're told that the case doesn't change the public health VCJD at-risk status of any patient, but then directors are asked to take these actions: send the enclosed letter to all patients with bleeding disorders, including those not at risk of VCJD. Please do this as quickly as possible, it said, and then make arrangements for appointments with any concerned patients. And then we can see it encloses information leaflets for both patients and for healthcare staff. I don't think we need to go through the detail of those leaflets. You've exhibited them to your statement. But can you give us again an overview of what triggered this 2009 exercise and how it was implemented by UK HCDO and by you in Manchester?
Well, the significance of this particular case remains uncertain, but it was certainly potentially evidence of possible developing variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease in a patient with haemophilia, presumably secondary to exposure to an implicated batch. The patient did in fact die from carcinoma and had no neurological signs or symptoms, and prion protein was not found in any other part of the autopsy. So there was no evidence of abnormal prion protein in the patient's brain. So it was just one little corner of his spleen. So the significance of this wasn't known, but there was certainly the theoretical possibility that had the patient not died of cancer and, say, lived another few years, he might have developed the Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. We'll obviously never know. I seem to remember that the patient was atypical also in that I don't think he was a homozygote for prion. I think he was heterozygous, which was also a little odd. And of course, it was 11 and a half years after his exposure to the implicated batch. So, well, whatever the uncertainties surrounding the interpretation of these findings, it was felt reasonable to inform the patients that this was perhaps evidence of transmission. So we wrote to all our patients again.
And so, as with the 2004 notification, this was a nationally organised and directed notification, to the extent that there was actually a template letter, which we won't look at the leaflets, but we'll look at the letter, WITN 3289132. So this is the letter that you were being asked to send to patients. We can see at the bottom it says it doesn't change the way in which the patient will be treated. So the purpose of this national notification presumably was to ensure that patients had the maximum up-to-date information for them to understand the position and apply it to their own personal circumstances.
That's right.
And then we can see the UK HCGO letter from you to your colleagues at WITN 3289133, please, Shumik. This is a letter dated the 16th of February 2009 from you, dear colleagues, and it says, unfortunately, due to circumstances beyond our control, this notification exercise has to go live on Monday, February the 16th, 2009. And you go on to explain there that the timing has had to be accelerated because the matter's being picked up in the national press.
Yes, we preferred them to hear from us.
Can you recall the kind of responses that your patients at Manchester showed in relation to this second notification exercise?
Well, it varied. Some were distressed, some were philosophical. Most of them thanked me for telling them. It did vary because apart from everything else, this was a little different from HIV and hepatitis C, in that, we have at this point been following it for a long time already, and we had been looking out for it, and frankly, when Jakob Creutzfeldt disease presents clinically, although it's very rare, it's a pretty easy diagnosis, and we hadn't spotted anything. So it seemed likely at that point that even if some patients did become affected, the numbers affected were likely to be quite small. And so I do not remember very much distress. I don't suppose the patients were very happy about it, but most of them seemed philosophical, and there wasn't much they could do about it, to be honest.
There's a follow-up letter then in April 2009 from you and Professor Hill to directors. WITN 3289120, please. We can see it's a letter to update on the current position. Point 1, the indexed patient investigation is continuing and risk assessments are awaited on the 4 potential routes of acquisition of Vcjd prion. What does that refer to, please? If you can remember.
I'm not quite sure what that means.
Don't worry.
The four potential routes of acquisition of variant CJD prion. I mean, there is always the possibility, of course, that the patient had not acquired this from blood products at all, but from a beef burger, which you also can't exclude. And I think that they may be referring to that. Clearly, the patient had been in receipt of an implicated batch, and you would not be able to exclude that as the route. Okay. But there were other possibilities.
And then the second point in the letter is about the notification exercise. And you record here that many centres wish to only contact patients in the at-risk for public health purposes group. Some centre directors, including some appointed since 2006, realised the at-risk status of their patients had not been determined, and patients who'd received implicated batches had not had their notes identified as at-risk for public health purposes. In some instances, there are contaminated instruments that need identification and public health follow-up to identify other patients who've been put at risk. So what is it that you, in your capacity as chair of UK HCDO and or in your capacity as director of the National Haemophilia Database by this time, what had you learnt about the notification exercise that gave rise to the need to write this letter?
A number of centre directors had retired, and their replacements had taken up post, and of course were not necessarily familiar with the previous notification exercise, since they had been juniors when this took place. Our most recent notification had alerted them to all this, and then they had gone away to find out which of their patients were implicated, and realised that the previous instructions had either not been followed or not followed adequately, and they had notified us, the database UK CDO, of this, and there was a catch-up necessary. They would also realise that if that was the case, then since at-risk patients had not been identified and had maybe had surgery, that they might have had the sort of surgery that was listed as a risk, gut surgery, that sort of thing, lymphoid surgery, with non-disposable instruments, which would have to be traced.
And then if we go over the page, we can see in the top paragraph, you set out that you're aware there have been no notifications of at-risk patients from some centres to the National Haemophilia Database, or some centres hadn't accounted fully for the total units of implicated products they received. And without going through the detail of the rest of the letter, as I understand it, the proposal here was that the National Haemophilia Database would tell each centre what information the database currently held in relation to patients at that centre, insofar as relevant to this issue, so that centres could effectively work out what data was missing and what they needed to submit to the database. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes, that's accurate.
There's a follow-up letter. I don't think we need to go to it, but there's a follow-up letter from this that you sent out in June 2009 that you've also exhibited to your statement. There was then, in 2010, an issue with a mistaken or false notification. Can you outline what happened there, please?
What happened there was that some of, when we originally worked out the period of risk, it was expressed in terms of years. The problem with that is that towards the end of that period of risk, BPL were beginning to manufacture products using imported American plasma. So you had circulating at one and the same time BPL products that had been manufactured from British or American plasma. As a result of that, some of the patients who had been notified that they were at risk, it turned out, had been treated with US sourced BPL products rather than UK sourced BPL products. So this applied to a very small number of people using specific products. So it applied almost exclusively to two centres, the Royal Free and Oxford. The Royal Free in particular because it related to factor 11 concentrate, and the Royal Free looks after possibly the largest group of factor 11 deficient patients in the country. They used concentrate to treat those patients rather than plasma. I've probably got the second largest group in the country, but my treatment practice is different, so it didn't affect us. So we realised that some patients had been told that they were at risk but were not. So we had to identify those and notify them.
And we can see from WITN 3289134, this is the letter that was then sent out by you on the 7th of April 2010 to all UK HCDO members and all haemophilia nurses. It reads, I've been told that a centre, and that was in fact the Royal Free, had mistakenly identified and notified a number of patients that they were at an increased risk of VCJD for public health purposes. These patients had in fact only been treated with BPL products manufactured from American source plasma. I'm writing to all haemophilia centres asking that all past VCJD risk notifications are checked, because I suspect that this error may have been repeated in other centres. So the matter having been raised with you, as I understand it from other documents you've exhibited to your statement, by the Royal Free, all centres were asked to do a check on their notifications. Do you know how many centres or how many patients turned out to have had the same problem as the Royal Free?
Well, the main other centre, as I mentioned, that was affected was Oxford. Most of the patients affected were at the Royal Free. I can't remember the precise number that were affected, but I think it was something like 20 patients.
And then in 2013, there was what has been referred to in the materials as a denotification exercise. So if we look, please, Shimik, at WITN 3289136, we can see this is a letter from the Health Protection Agency dated the 24th of January 2013 to Dr. Dolan, who by now had taken over as chair of UK HCDO. Reassessment of VCJD risk from UK produced plasma products and denotification of certain recipients. And we can see that there's been a review by the Health Protection Agency of the risk assessment, which has led to recommendations that individuals who received factor 8 and factor 9 between 1990 and 2001 should remain notified as at risk of VCJD for public health purposes. But 2, individuals who only received plasma products between 1980 and 1989 should now have their treatment history reassessed to confirm this fact, and if it is confirmed, they should be de-notified. And then if we go to the letter sent out by Dr. Dolan to directors, it's WITN 3289137. So this is Dr. Dolan enclosing the HPA letter, the recommendations. It says, please don't take action immediately. What we've agreed is that NHD, the National Haemophilia Database, will review the records to generate lists for each centre. These lists will then be sent to each centre to be verified. There should be formal communication between each centre and the National Haemophilia Database to confirm the risks and discuss any errors. In the meantime, the UK HCDO Executive, NHD and Morbidity and Mortality Working Party will work on producing information which will be of help in discussions with patients who are to be de-notified. And without going through the detail of the remaining documents on this issue, can you set out what then happened in terms of the de-notification exercise from your perspective?
Well, we produce spreadsheets based on the previous returns from each centre, which had lists of patients that we considered could possibly be de-notified. There was then a dialogue between each centre and the database to fill out any missing data and produce a final corrected list of patients who should be told that the risk had been reassessed and they were no longer considered to be at public health risk. This took a little time. I think was quite a lot of work for the database and for centres, but we wanted to get it right. As you can imagine, given the history of this exercise and its complexity. And then the patients were notified by the centre. It was not clinically urgent. I think most centres would have discussed it at the next patient appointment.
And then in terms of the current position, does the...
I forgot one important thing. The other thing is that they changed the policy in relation to endoscopes and disposable instruments. And so we all had to take these out of quarantine.
Okay, I'm going to ask you about that in a moment, but just in terms of this information in this letter, does it remain the case in terms of the current position as at 2020 that individuals who received Factor 8 and Factor 9 between 1990 and 2001 are regarded as at risk of variant CJD for public health purposes?
Yes.
And then in terms of the practical consequences of being so regarded, could we have, please, BART 40924? So this is a annual general meeting of UK HCDO, 13th of October 2005. If we could go, please, to the 4th page. No, sorry, that's the wrong document. I think on my note is the wrong document. Well, we can look at this and pick up the picture from this, I think. Could you just go back to the front page, please, Shumik? And could we go on? So this is a meeting on the 16th of May 2005. There's then a second meeting in October that we'll look at. If we could go on to the next page, please. And the next page. Yes. So under the heading VCJD issues, the second paragraph reads, endoscopies. Charles Hay reported the trouble Manchester is having with endoscopies. from an ensuing discussion, it was clear that different policies are being pursued in different centres, and then there's a reference to updating information on the website. What was the trouble that Manchester was having with endoscopies, and how was it resolved, if at all?
The problem was that endoscopy, because there's a lot of lymphoid tissue in the gut, was considered a potential risk for transmission. So the worry was that an endoscope could transmit variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt cell disease to the next patient that used it, for example. I mean, endoscopes obviously cleaned in between use, but prion protein's quite sticky, and we didn't have any evidence to know whether the cleaning procedure for an endoscope would get rid of prion protein were that instrument to be contaminated with it. There eventually emerged evidence suggesting, for example, that metal instruments used during surgery, if they were autoclaved several times, probably would be safe, but that evidence wasn't around right at the beginning. So the instruction was that if you used an endoscope in a patient that was considered at high risk, you should quarantine that instrument and only use it for that patient. So we had a growing number of endoscopes with my patients' names on them that couldn't be used for anybody else. And in fact, I had one patient with type 3 von Willebrand's disease who required repeat endoscopy using a double balloon endoscope, which is a particularly expensive instrument costing £50,000. And we actually bought one just for him. Eventually, my hospital had something like £750,000 worth of endoscopes in quarantine. And that was at least 3/4 of all the endoscopes in the hospital, and was threatening the endoscopy service with collapse through lack of instruments. Now, the situation was eventually improved because the Department of Health made money available for the purchase of additional instruments. I think some other centres were perhaps not following this policy as assiduously, but my understanding is that it was a problem in most really large haemophilia centres, like the Royal Free, because if you have a large number of patients, you're bound to need to endoscope some of them on a fairly regular basis.
And you said, I think a few moments ago when we were talking about the 2013 denotification exercise, that there had been a change of policy in relation to endoscopes.
Yes, well, there was a change in policy overall, because that reassessment was more wide-ranging than merely reassessing the period of risk. It reassessed the level of risk. Now, if you remember right at the beginning, they admitted that when they assessed the risk of transmission through blood products way back at the beginning of this exercise, the Vcjd incidence panel always used the most pessimistic assumption. Now, I remember at the time wondering how they could make any assessment at all, because so little was known. There were so many variables. And I saw the calculations, and the assumptions themselves ran to 2 pages of A4 single-spaced 10-point type. So the only way that they could make any sort of assessment at all was by making educated assessments and lots of assumptions. Now, it became clear by 2009, far less the later period, that these assumptions had to be far too pessimistic, because if they had been correct, we would have seen tens of patients with variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease, and we had seen none. And so when they made the reassessment, they had to take into account what we'd actually observed in the previous decade, i.e. 0. And so they changed their assumptions, and they revised their assessment of risk downwards in general. So we changed the period of risk, and we also revised downwards our assessment of the risk to those who continued to be considered a public health risk. And so it was no longer felt necessary to quarantine surgical instruments, to use disposable instruments, or to quarantine endoscopes at all.
You referred to they reassessing the risk in that regard. Was that the Health Protection Agency?
Yes, and the variant Jakob-Creutzfeldt incidence panel. Yeah.
We've heard
it
from...
not our assessment.
We've heard from both from individual patients and through the statements of some clinicians that there were centres where the practical implications of the policy over the years that it was in place was that there were occasions where surgery was deferred or cancelled, often at short notice, because of the concern about instruments. Was that a problem in Manchester?
I think it was a problem everywhere. It's a problem that we tried to mitigate. Operations got cancelled sometimes when people seemed to realise at the last minute that the patient was at risk. You could minimise cancellations by planning the whole thing so that you should identify who was and was not at risk in advance of surgery, so that appropriate disposable instruments would be available, for example.
Before we leave the topic of VCJD completely, there's just one issue I wanted to ask you about, arising out of some of the exhibits to your statement and the VCJD surveillance study. I'm not going to ask you about the detail of that work because we have that covered in documentation elsewhere, but if we have WITN 3289148, please. This is a letter, it's from Professor Hill, dated the 22nd of June 2007, but you've exhibited it and it relates in part to the database, so I'm hoping you can help us with it. So it refers to Professor Lee having obtained ethical approval for a number of studies relating to VCJD, haemophilia and implicated products. And then below the two numbered paragraphs, there's a paragraph that says, with regard to the post-mortem studies, we've obtained a list of patients with haemophilia whose death certificates indicate that there may have been a post-mortem or a post-mortem may occur. These names are being linked on the database. I will be writing separately to inquire if you can check if a post-mortem has taken place and whether or not material is available. James Ironside has indicated he will be prepared, as in the original submission, to look at relevant material. So there appears to have been a proposal to study material obtained either from post-mortems that have already taken place or from post-mortems that may take place prospectively. Just want to show you two further documents and then ask you a question about it. If we have, please, Shumik, WITN 3289150. So this is a draft consent form for seeking consent from the next of kin for results of post-mortem examination. Reference is made in the bold print to the concern about Vcjd and the proposed prospective and retrospective surveillance study that was being undertaken. It contains provision for the relative to agree to the post-mortem examination being performed. It explains samples will be sent to the National CJD Surveillance Centre in Edinburgh, where they'll be examined, that the results will be available to the relative, and then it provides it's your decision as to whether you wish to be informed specifically of the results of the tests for Vcjd, and then provisions made for the relative to sign. So, as I understand it, that addresses the question of obtaining consent from the next of kin for post-mortems prospectively, so for any post-mortems that might be undertaken following the production of these documents. If we go, please, Shumik, to WITN 3289151. We can see this is a further document relating to the proposed Vcjd surveillance study, and we can see data is going to be collected through the National Haemophilia database. If we go to the third page, please, Shumik. We can see under the heading Prospective Study of Post-Mortem Material, provision is made for consent to be obtained from relatives, and we've just looked at a sample form. In relation to the retrospective study of post-mortem and biopsy material, it says this: in the period 1985 to 1998, at least 88 post-mortems were performed out of a total of 1,300 haemophilic deaths, as reported to the UK HCDO database. Wherever possible, centres should establish the extent of their post-mortem material and refer relevant sections to the CJD unit following liaison with the study coordinator. Help with the tracking and retrieval of specimens may be available. No additional consent is required for this. In the case of biopsy material available in deceased patients, similar action should be taken. And then where the patient is still alive, so presumably that's in relation to biopsy material, consent would be required for such an examination using the retrospective analysis consent form. So it would appear that in relation to the retrospective study of post-mortem material and indeed biopsy material from deceased patients, there was no intention to notify relatives or seek their agreement. I'm seeking to establish this as a matter of fact. Is that your understanding from this material?
That's my understanding. I know that they took this question to the ethical committee, and it was discussed also with the CJD unit in Edinburgh, and it was the ethical committee's opinion that we didn't need to. I wasn't involved in that, but I know that this issue was examined.
Do you know whether in your capacity as director of the Manchester Centre or in your capacity as director of the National Haemophilia database, the extent to which centres hold post-mortem material that would have been covered by this study?
Well, that's part of the problem, because I don't think that they do. You know, after the Alder Hay scandal, retention of material was dramatically reduced. The Human Tissue Act has a lot to say about the retention of material, and so retrospectively there is little or nothing available. The sort of deposit, tiny deposit of prion protein in the spleen of that patient that we reported in 2009 would not have been picked up by a standard autopsy. Standard autopsy would have completely missed it. It's not a macroscopic appearance that we're talking about. It's carefully slicing up the spleen and using a very specific stain to see what you're looking for. So you have to be looking for that specifically. Frankly, the chance that this would have picked anything up was relatively slight anyway. So I don't think there were large amounts of retained material.
And do you know what the position is in relation to Manchester specifically? When you became director in '94,
Sure, we had nothing. I know that as a centre, we contributed nothing to this study.
Okay. So I note the time, and I'm about to move on to another topic. So would this be the right moment to take the break?
Yes, it would. We'll take a break for half an hour, as usual. Allow you to get a cup of coffee. And we'll be back at 11:45.
Thank you, sir.
11:45.